Mile marker, 77. I started the shift the same way I had every night for years. Coffee cooling in the cup holder. Dashboard lights humming in a soft electric glow, and the long stretch of highway rolling out in front of me like a dark ribbon no one wanted to touch. Locals avoided this part of the route after sundown. They joked about it during daylight, swore at it during storms, and warned new drivers not to linger near mile marker 77, but to me, it was just terrain. Quiet, predictable, almost comforting in its emptiness. The first hour slipped by in routine motions. A dead coyote on the shoulder, a tarp caught in sagebrush, one speeding citation from a pickup that barely slowed down long enough for me to hand the ticket through the window. Nothing unusual, nothing worth remembering. But somewhere, past the county line, the radio began to hiss. Soft at first, almost beneath hearing, like wind threading through dry grass. There wasn't a cloud in the sky, and the cliffs around me didn't usually cause interference. Still, I turned the volume down, assuming it was just a weak signal bouncing off rock. The static pulsed once. Then again, a slow, rhythmic breathing buried inside it. I leaned forward, listening without meaning to. The sound didn't match weather patterns, didn't match engine feedback, didn't match anything I'd heard on duty. It was too deliberate, too measured, almost like it was waiting for something. But just as quickly as it started, the pulse thinned out. The radio settled into total silence, the kind that fills a cruiser when the engine noise blends with the darkness outside, and the world feels suspended. By the time I approached mile marker 77, the night was unnervingly calm. The road ahead seemed to swallow the beams of my headlights, as if the darkness were denser there, thicker, like I was driving toward a place that didn't want to be seen. I slowed without thinking. No cars behind me, no cars ahead. Just the stretch of asphalt and that lonely white marker on the right side of the road. The air inside the cruiser grew colder. I rubbed my hands together, even though the heater was on. Something about passing that marker for the first time in the shift felt different, like the night had just taken its first careful breath. And it was waiting for me to take mine. The second night felt heavier the moment I clocked in, though I tried to convince myself it was nothing more than leftover tension from mile marker 77. The highway stretched out the same as always, quiet, hollow, and washed in thin moonlight. But the moment I rolled past the first ridge, the radio responded like it had been waiting for me. A faint static threaded through the speakers, softer than it had the night before, almost shy. For a few minutes I ignored it, chalking it up to the same interference I had assumed earlier. But then the static curled inward, thinning into sharp breaths. Slow, deliberate inhalations that didn't belong to me and didn't match the rhythm of the engine. I eased the cruiser onto the shoulder, letting the headlights spill across the rock face. Cliff formations sometimes reflected signals in strange ways. I'd known that since training, but the sound filtering through the speaker didn't behave like reflected anything. The breaths sharpened into syllables, soft, broken pieces of language, like someone trying to talk through a thin layer of water. I leaned closer, not sure whether I wanted to hear it better or prove to myself I was imagining it. The syllables slid together, clear enough to form a single word, then another. My name, then my badge number. Spoken perfectly, but without cadence, like a voice reading information off a page it should not have had access to. A cold ripple moved up my spine. I grabbed my phone, switched to the voice recorder, and held it near the speaker. The second I hit record, the sound collapsed. Not faded, collapsed. The breaths snapped off, the static died, and my cruiser filled with the empty hum of the idling engine. When I played the recording back, all I got was silence. Not even the usual ambient hiss of white noise. The air outside felt warmer when I stepped out, even though the night should have been cooling faster. I walked a few steps into the gravel, scanning the ridgeline. Nothing moved, no wind, no insects. Even the highway felt like it was holding still. I waited a long moment before getting back inside, half expecting the radio to pick up where it left off. But the signal stayed dead the rest of the night. Not quiet, dead. Like whatever had spoken had finished what it needed to say, and it was just waiting for the next time I passed mile marker 77. Night 2 on the hollow run should have felt routine, but the moment I turned past the last service station and the desert widened out, I spotted something that didn't belong there. A sedan sitting crooked on the shoulder near the dunes, its hazard lights blinking in a slow, tired rhythm. Even before I stopped the cruiser, I saw all 4 doors hanging open, fanned out like whoever had been inside left in a hurry or all at once. The headlights glared straight into the sand, bleaching the ground white and revealing a set of drag marks leading away from the driver's side, deep, scalloped grooves that cut a perfect line into the open desert. I stepped out with my flashlight raised, calling out into the dark, but the only answer was the dry rasp of wind brushing across the dunes. No footprints trailed the drag marks, no tire impressions, nothing to explain what had made them or where they went. As I edged toward the line in the sand, I caught the faintest ripple of movement far beyond the reach of my light, something slipping out of sight, as though it had been watching the car and ducked away the moment I arrived. The air went still, unnaturally still, the kind that makes the back of your neck tighten. I swept the beam across the dunes again, slower this time, but whatever I'd glimpsed was already gone, or hiding. And the longer I stared into the darkness past that empty sedan, the more I felt like something was staring back, waiting for me to take one more step toward those drag marks disappearing into nowhere. I circled the sedan slowly, keeping one hand on my holster as the hazard lights blinked in a steady pulse, throwing long, warped shadows across the sand. Every few seconds, I felt that prickling sensation between my shoulder blades, like someone was pacing just behind me, matching my steps but staying out of sight. My dash cam hummed louder than usual, a faint electronic vibration that almost sounded nervous, as if the equipment itself was reacting to whatever lingered out there. I knelt beside the drag marks again, watching as a sudden gust of hot wind rolled across the highway, sweeping grains of sand over them until the grooves softened, then vanished entirely beneath the shifting surface. When I stood, instinct pulled my attention to the dark perimeter beyond the headlights. I didn't see anything directly, not at first, but the shadows didn't fall right. They stretched and recoiled as though something moved just outside the beam, circling, searching for an angle my eyes hadn't caught yet. Back in the cruiser, reviewing the dash cam on fast forward, I froze when a flicker appeared on the playback. A pale blur gliding around the edge of the car, not walking, not running, just drifting. I replayed it twice before stepping back out, but the night had already swallowed the perimeter whole again. Whatever was out there wasn't afraid of the light. It was only waiting for the moment I stopped looking. By the third night, the highway felt abandoned in a way I hadn't sensed before, like every driver on that stretch had silently agreed to stay clear after sundown. Traffic thinned until it vanished completely, leaving nothing but the dull hum of my engine and the long, empty ribbon of pavement ahead. I kept telling myself I wouldn't stop at mile marker 77 again, not after the radio, not after the car with its doors open. But the closer I got, the more a strange pressure settled in my chest, a pull that felt almost physical. When the reflective numbers finally appeared in my headlights, I eased off the gas without meaning to, rolling to a stop beside the marker as though something had guided my hands. The moment I stepped out, the silence deepened. Even the desert insects seemed to avoid this patch of road. I swept the beam of my flashlight across the asphalt, then toward the dunes, when a tall, sharp shadow flickered through my high beams, too stretched, too thin. and far taller than any person should be. I froze where I stood, waiting for the shape to reappear, but the darkness closed over it like it had never been there at all. Then the radio crackled inside the cruiser, not with static, but with a single whisper sliding through the speaker in a low, deliberate breath. "Look behind." My skin tightened before my mind could process the words, and I turned slowly, knowing something was already waiting in the middle of the road. I turned toward the center of the road, and there, standing in the wash of my fading headlights, was the missing driver from the abandoned sedan. He was motionless, planted in the lane as if he'd simply grown out of the asphalt. His clothes matched the dashcam photo I'd studied earlier, right down to the windbreaker creased at the collar, but something about him was profoundly wrong. His eyes caught the light, reflecting it back with a cold metallic sheen, even after the cruiser's headlights flickered and died, plunging the highway into a dim half-dark. The glow didn't dim with the loss of the lights. If anything, it brightened, as though his eyes weren't reflecting anything. They were emitting. I called out to him, loud enough for my voice to echo between the cliffs, but he didn't acknowledge me. He didn't flinch, blink, or breathe. When I stepped closer, his body didn't adjust or brace the way a living person would. He held his balance like a mannequin set in concrete. A soft pressure brushed my right ear, warm, intimate, too close to be wind, followed by the same whisper from before, threading through the air without a source. Again. I tightened my grip on my weapon, realizing the whisper wasn't coming from the radio anymore. It was coming from the road, from the air, from somewhere around both of us. And as I raised my flashlight toward the driver's face, those bright, unnatural eyes didn't follow the beam. They were fixed on me, like they had been long before I turned around. The driver lifted his foot, but the movement wasn't a step. It was a glide, a slow, unnatural slide across the asphalt, as though he'd been pulled forward on an invisible track. His joints didn't bend, his posture didn't sway, the entire body moved in one stiff piece, closing the distance between us without a sound. My instincts finally broke through whatever held me frozen, and I raised my weapon, shouting a warning he didn't react to. He kept coming, the glow in his eyes intensifying until it looked like two thin beams cutting through the dark. When he slid within a few feet, I fired. The gunshot cracked open the silence, echoing off the cliffs and startling a flock of desert birds into a frantic burst of wings above us. For a split second, the blast illuminated his face, and then he wasn't standing there anymore. No fall, no recoil, no collapse. He dissolved into the darkness like heat shimmer dispersing on a highway, the fading outline of a silhouette thinning until it was swallowed by the night. The air around me snapped cold, my breath fogged, and suddenly the road was empty again, the only proof I'd fired at all being the warm shell casing that bounced once on the asphalt, then spun to a stop near my boot. By the time backup arrived, lights flaring across the dunes, there wasn't a single footprint, shadow, or trace of the man they'd sent me out looking for. Just that casing, still carrying my fingerprint. The passenger in the back seat. The first night I patrolled that stretch of mountain highway felt like stepping into a world that had quietly shut itself down. Snow drifted across the asphalt in slow, whispering sheets, the kind that swallowed sound and made the whole forest seem to hold its breath. For hours, nothing moved except the wind weaving through the pines. I remember thinking how still everything felt. Too still for a road that usually carried long-haul trucks and restless travelers. Even my own engine sounded muffled, as if the cold was swallowing it inch by inch. A few minutes past 2, a shape emerged through the blowing white. An SUV pulled halfway off the shoulder, angled like someone had fought the wheel at the last second. The engine hummed softly under a skin of frost, still warm enough to send a faint shimmer of heat into the air. But every window was frozen solid from the inside, opaque and brittle like sheets of old ice. That was wrong. windows don't freeze like that unless something inside makes them. I stepped out, boots crunching into snow that hadn't been touched by another set of tracks. No prints leading away, none circling the vehicle. Just the SUV, abandoned in a bowl of darkness. As I approached the driver's side, the door suddenly swung open. A man stumbled out, pale, shaking, breath pulsing in short, terrified clouds. He kept his eyes locked on the vehicle like he expected something to crawl up from the back seat at any moment. His voice came out in a ragged whisper, just 7 words that clung to the cold air. I wasn't alone. It was right there. He didn't point. He didn't have to. The way he leaned away from the SUV told me exactly where he meant. I walked past him toward the open door. The interior light flickered weakly, glowing against frozen glass. Every instinct I had told me to slow down, to take my time, to listen first. But there was nothing. No movement, no breathing, no shifting weight on the seats. Just stillness. I leaned into the cabin, letting my eyes adjust. The front looked normal, a phone charger dangling, a coffee cup half full and still warm. The faint, lingering smell of someone who'd been inside only minutes before. But the back seat felt wrong. It wasn't anything I saw. It was what I didn't see. The air seemed thicker there, almost darkened, like the shadows had settled into a single, unmoving mass. The headrest sat perfectly upright, the cushions untouched, but the space felt occupied in a way I can't explain, like someone had been sitting there long enough to leave their presence behind. I waited for something to move, some shift of fabric or creak of suspension, but nothing happened. Still comma. As I backed out of the SUV, the sense of someone watching from that empty seat clung to me like cold fingers trailing across the back of my neck. And I wasn't sure if the man had truly escaped whatever he'd found in his car, or if it had simply stepped out with him. I circled the SUV with the same steady rhythm I'd used for years, but the snow around it told me more than the vehicle ever could. No tracks, no drag marks, no signs that anyone had walked away. When I opened the rear door, the cabin breathed out a cold that didn't match the night, the kind that slipped under the collar and settled against the spine. Every seat looked perfectly undisturbed, yet the driver kept shifting behind me, eyes darting over my shoulder as though something inside was following my movements. Frost clung to the interior windows in branching patterns, thin white veins spreading across the glass, and as I watched, they curled into shapes, almost like fingerprints, before melting back into nothing. The air felt heavier the longer I stood there, as if whatever had been in that back seat had only just lifted itself away, leaving the faintest echo of warmth beneath the ice. By the time I closed the door, the handle burned cold against my glove, and a single thought pressed in harder than the wind. Something had been inside that SUV, and it hadn't gone far. I walked the driver back to the cruiser, keeping a steady hand on his shoulder as he glanced over his own footsteps like he expected them to be replaced by someone else's. The warmth of the patrol car felt almost artificial after the cold pressed into that SUV, but I settled him in and ran the plates, watching the snow slide across the windshield in slow, uneven trails. At 2:41 a.m., while the radio cracked with weak static, my rearview mirror caught a shape sitting upright in the SUV's back seat. A dark outline, too still to be human, too solid to be a trick of light. I blinked once, and the silhouette shifted, as if adjusting itself into a more comfortable position. My breath stalled. When I turned around to look directly, the back seat was empty, the windows darker than before, sealed in a sheet of frost that hadn't been there a minute earlier. And even from the cruiser I could feel that same thick presence reaching across the road, watching both of us from inside that frozen shell of a vehicle. I forced myself back toward the SUV, telling the driver to stay put, even though he was already shaking his head, eyes fixed on something only he could see. The moment I opened the door, the cold inside hit me like a wall. Sharper, heavier, the kind that didn't belong to the mountain night, but to someplace much deeper. My breath spilled into the beam of my flashlight and drifted toward the back seats as though pulled by a slow, steady inhale. The light followed it, catching the fresh imprints on the inside of the rear windshield, long, narrow handprints pressed into the frost, fingers splayed too wide, too thin, as if someone had leaned forward and spread both hands against the glass just seconds earlier. I stepped closer, feeling the warmth draining from my fingertips, when a faint metallic click snapped through the cabin behind me. The sound of a seatbelt pulling tight, as if something had just settled into the empty seat beside me and fastened itself in for the ride. The scream cut through the wind before I even cleared the SUV's door. Raw, broken. The kind of sound a person makes when they think something is touching them in the dark. I sprinted across the snow, each breath tearing colder as I reached the cruiser and saw the driver thrashing against the seatbelt, his hands clawing at the strap like it was tightening on its own. Frost raced across the radio panel in branching veins, swallowing the display until the numbers blurred into white. The air dropped hard, heavy enough that my lungs burned as I leaned into the car, trying to free him. But the cushion behind me shifted, with a slow, deliberate weight, compressing downward as though someone had settled into the seat, inches from my back. The driver's eyes fixed on the space over my shoulder, widening with a terror that didn't belong to anything he could see, only to what he felt pressing in beside us, unseen and breathing in the cold. I kept one hand on the driver's shoulder, trying to quiet his shaking long enough to cut the belt, but the cruiser felt smaller with every passing second, the air thickening as if the cold itself had weight. The mirror showed nothing behind me, only the dim interior glow, but the cushion still dipped inward, a slow, deliberate pressure that matched the rise and fall of someone else's breath. Static swallowed the radio until it was nothing but a wet, uneven hiss, and beneath it came a faint exhale pushing through the patrol channel, close enough that it felt like it touched the inside of my ear. The driver choked out that the passenger had followed us, that it hadn't stopped watching since the moment we'd left the SUV, and as my body cam flickered against my chest, the darkness behind me leaned forward. A cold presence brushing the back of my neck just as the camera died, leaving us in the silent, freezing dark. By the time backup reached Route 19, the night had settled into that gray, pre-dawn stillness where even the wind feels hesitant to move. They followed the unanswered radio burst to my cruiser, parked at an angle on the shoulder with its lights still rotating weakly through the fogged windows. Every door was locked from the inside, the glass coated in a thick frost that painted the interior white. When they finally forced a way in, the cold that spilled out felt unnatural, like the air had been sealed for hours with something that didn't breathe. Seats, consoles, and floor mats were all untouched except for one detail. The back seat, the one directly behind where I had been sitting, showed a deep, unmistakable human-shaped indentation pressed into the cushion, as though someone had remained there long after the engine died. And on the inside of the rear window, beneath the haze of frozen moisture, streaks of melting frost formed the outline of a face, cheek, nose, brow, pressed outward as if it had leaned close to look at whoever finally opened the door, waiting to be seen. Dead lane. The highway looked different in the early hours, quieter than I remembered, as if the years since retirement had stripped away whatever noise used to follow me along these routes. I came back to mile marker 19 because the dates and times refused to leave me alone. Every fatal collision, every overturned sedan, every shattered windshield had bled into the same minute of the night, 3:12 a.m. Even long after signing my final exit papers, That number clung to me like a stain I couldn't wash off. I reached the marker just after dawn, hoping daylight would blunt the edge of a memory that had never settled right. But the fog was waiting for me, heavy, low, clinging to the road like it had grown from the asphalt instead of the sky. It rolled over the shoulder and swallowed the tree line in slow breaths, revealing nothing, hiding everything. I stepped out of my truck into a stillness so complete it felt rehearsed, as though the world had paused until I decided what to do next. The air tasted metallic, the kind of cold that doesn't match the temperature, more like a draft drifting out of an old basement. I tried grounding myself in routine, flipping open the worn notebook I always carried, the one where every notation lived in the same clipped handwriting. I wrote down the date, the time, the visibility, and the strange way the fog seemed to press against my boots. But when my pen touched paper again, something at the edge of the pavement caught my eye. Thin black curves in the mist, cutting into the road at a shallow angle. Skid marks, fresh ones. So fresh, the rubber still looked wet. I walked toward them without thinking, feeling that old instinct rise in my chest, the one that once pulled me from warm beds and late dinners. The fog followed me, thickening between each step, making the marks appear and disappear like they were struggling to stay visible. I crouched down and placed a hand over the first line. No dust, no fading. Whoever made them had done so minutes ago. But the road was dead silent, and there hadn't been a single engine sound since I arrived. I traced the lines with my eyes, following their arc, expecting them to lead toward the shoulder or into the ditch like nearly every crash did out here, but these didn't veer. They straightened. They ended. Not gradually, not in a drift. They cut off in the middle of the lane like someone had taken a blade and erased the rest of the story. My breath fogged the air, curling upward before fading into the pale haze above me. I stood and walked the remaining feet toward where the marks vanished. The pavement looked wrong where they ended. Smooth, untouched, perfect. No gravel displaced, no grooves, no patchwork. Just an abrupt stop, the kind that never happens on a road that has taken this many lives. A prickle crawled across my arms as I imagined the movement that caused those lines. Tires screaming. A driver fighting to regain control. The weight of a car pitching forward. And yet none of that was here. Not a headlight shard, not a scrape. Not a single sign that a vehicle had continued beyond that point. I turned slowly, scanning the fog. The tree line was a smudged silhouette, the shapes of the pines bending in ways that didn't match the wind. The world felt suspended, as if the accident hadn't happened yet but was seconds away, waiting for its cue. My boots felt heavier the longer I stood there, like the road wanted me still, anchored. Something about the silence pressed at the edges of my thoughts. It wasn't absence of sound, it was the expectation of it, the sense that the fog was holding its breath for me to notice something I hadn't yet seen. I looked down once more at the perfect, unbroken asphalt in front of me. Fresh skid marks ending in nothing, ending in smooth pavement, ending as though the road itself had taken the rest. A part of me already knew I should have turned back then, closed the notebook, and walked away. But I stayed there, staring at the place where the tracks vanished, and a thought whispered through me so quietly it felt borrowed from someone else's memory. Whatever happened here didn't end with the car, and the fog shifted, just enough to suggest something else had been standing where I was now. I didn't see it, I only felt the emptiness it left behind, and I knew I wasn't finished. Not with this road, not with this hour, not with whatever waited beyond that razor-clean line in the pavement. The fog thickened so quickly it felt alive, rising in slow folds around my legs and climbing the length of the cruiser like it was testing the metal for warmth. I moved along the pavement where the skid marks had ended, trying to make sense of the stillness, when my radio let out a thin crackle. Just a faint fizz of static at first, the kind that comes when the weather turns. But then it repeated a number in a warped, stuttering loop. A timestamp I'd spent half my career logging into incident reports. 312, 312, 312. Each repetition grew sharper, as though the signal wasn't coming from dispatch but from somewhere much closer, maybe even inside the fog itself. I reached for the handset, tapped it against my palm, and checked the frequency, but the display flickered like it couldn't decide whether it was turned on or off. The world around me muted, as if the fog had crawled into my ears and padded them with wool. Even the crunch of gravel under my boots faded into a faint, distant echo, like I was listening to someone else walk instead of myself. The air cooled in a way that wasn't natural, the kind of cold that moves, not with wind, but with intention. It passed over my face like a slow exhale, brushing the skin under my jaw and sliding beneath my collar. I tightened my coat, but the chill stayed, clinging to the bones. I turned toward the tree line, expecting to see movement in the branches, but the trees were swallowed completely, their shapes drowned in the gray curtain that seemed to pulse with each breath I took. For a moment, I thought the fog itself might be drifting against the flow of the wind, pushing inland instead of rolling down from the marsh. My radio crackled again, louder this time, the timestamp breaking into a long, stretched-out tone that rose until it buzzed in the metal belt clip at my waist. My breath caught. Not from fear, I told myself, but from the sudden pressure in the air like the atmosphere had thickened. Then the silence ruptured. A figure emerged through the heavy veil ahead of me, faint at first, no more than a pale smear against the whiteness. It grew clearer only in shape, not in detail. A person, barefoot, stepping across the lane with the slow, steady gait of someone who didn't notice the cold or the world around them. The fog seemed to bend around the figure instead of parting, like it refused to touch them. I couldn't tell if they were walking with purpose or drifting, but each step landed without a sound, leaving no imprint on the wet asphalt. My hand hovered near my holster out of habit, though I knew a weapon had never solved anything on this road. I opened my mouth to call out, but the fog swallowed my voice before it could travel. The figure kept moving, turning its head slightly, but not toward me. Just enough to show the outline of a face that didn't seem fully formed, like someone had drawn the features and erased them before the ink dried. My radio let out a final burst of static, the timestamp collapsing into a long drag of white noise that rattled my teeth. The figure crossed the lane and vanished into the opposite side of the fog as though stepping behind an invisible wall. I took a single step forward, pulse thudding in my ears, but the fog sealed the space where the figure had disappeared, erasing every trace of the crossing. The radio went silent. The world went silent. And for the first time since I'd returned to mile marker 19, I felt the unmistakable sense that something had just walked through my timeline, not along it. I called out before I fully realized I was doing it. A reflex born from years on the job, the kind of instinct meant to reassure stranded motorists or wandering hikers. But the fog swallowed my voice the same way it had swallowed the figure. Quickly, hungrily, as if sound didn't belong here anymore. The shape ahead of me didn't slow or react. It kept drifting forward with that strange weightless stride, bare feet gliding over asphalt slick with dew. I moved after it, not out of bravery but out of something sharper. A need to understand how someone could walk like that in near-freezing cold without leaving so much as a smudge on the pavement. As I stepped closer, the fog curled away from her body, peeling back just enough to reveal an outline but never the full form. It wasn't the way fog typically moved around heat. This wasn't warmth pushing moisture aside. It was the opposite. An absence, a void, a space where the air refused to settle. I could hear my own breathing louder than anything else, the rhythm uneven, bouncing back at me like an echo trapped inside the mist. I reached her within 10, maybe 12 feet, close enough to see long pale hair hanging motionless down her back despite the breeze that tugged at my jacket. I raised a hand instinctively, not to touch, but to signal. Slow, open, cautious. She didn't respond, didn't turn, didn't shiver. Her steps remained steady, each footfall perfectly silent. No slap of skin on road, no scrape of grit. It was like the ground didn't notice her at all. When the fog shifted again, just for a second, I caught a glimpse of her face as she turned slightly, not enough to look at me, just enough to show a cheek, a jawline, the faint impression of features. But no breath left her lips, not even the faintest cloud in the cold morning air. That absence chilled me more than the temperature ever could. I took another step, trying to guide her toward the shoulder, toward anything that wasn't the center of the road. My boots made soft, gritty sounds that seemed out of place next to her silence. "Ma'am?" I tried again, though the word felt thin and swallowed before it finished forming. Her head tilted a fraction, as though hearing something I couldn't, then straightened. She continued forward. I followed her path with my eyes, realizing she wasn't meandering. She wasn't lost. She was walking toward nothing, straight into a thickness of fog that looked denser than the rest, like a wall of white hung from the sky. The closer she came to it, the more the fog seemed to reshape itself, bending inward in a slow, deliberate pull. I quickened my pace, cutting the distance between us to only a few steps. I reached out, not to grab her, just to catch her attention, to anchor her in this world before she walked into that curtain of nothingness. But before my hand could close the distance, she passed through the thickest part of the fog and vanished. Not faded, not disappeared around a bend. One moment she existed. The next, she dissolved as though stepping into a doorway carved into the mist. The fog swallowed the spot instantly, smoothing over any disturbance. No trace of her remained. The silence that followed pressed against my chest, heavier than before, as if the fog itself were holding its breath. I stood there, arm half raised, frozen between instinct and disbelief, staring at the place where she had stepped out of reality. And somewhere, deep inside the mist, a single footstep sounded, soft, distant, and not belonging to me. The fog felt thicker after she disappeared, like it had inhaled her and now tightened around the highway with a kind of quiet hunger. I lowered my hand slowly, unsure whether I had imagined the soft footstep that echoed through the mist a moment earlier. The cold settled deeper into my jacket, creeping along my spine, making the hairs at the back of my neck lift in a way they hadn't in years. I turned in a slow circle, trying to hear anything beyond my own breathing, but the world had gone muted again. No wind, no birds, not even the distant hum of passing traffic. For a stretch of road once known for constant tragedies, it felt unnaturally paused, like the next event hadn't been given permission to start yet. I took a step backward toward my cruiser, boots tapping lightly on the asphalt, when the fog behind me ripped open with a sound so violent and sudden it felt like the air itself had torn. Metal shrieked, loud enough to cut through the silence like a blade. I spun around, instinct overriding disbelief, and there it was. A sedan that hadn't been there seconds earlier crumpled in the middle of the lane. Steam and smoke curled from the hood, rising into the fog and blending into its rolling shape. The headlights flickered weakly, struggling against the whiteout haze dot. My mind tried to force some logical order into what I was seeing. Maybe I'd missed the approach, maybe the fog had muffled the engine, but deep down, I knew I hadn't heard a single tire on asphalt, not a single approach, not even gravel snapping under weight. The car simply appeared, like it had been placed there between one breath and the next. I rushed forward, my heartbeat thudding in my ears as I leaned into the driver's window. A man slumped against the wheel, dazed, blood running in a thin line from his temple. His eyes fluttered open when I touched his shoulder, unfocused at first, then widening in terror. His lips moved, trembling around the words that scraped out in a hoarse whisper. I swerved. For a woman. Right there. His gaze jerked past me toward the empty shoulder, toward the dense wall of fog where the barefoot figure had walked only minutes ago. I turned, following his shaking finger, and felt a cold weight settle in my stomach. The fog along the shoulder wasn't drifting like the rest. It was moving, slowly, purposefully, rolling across the lane in a steady, deliberate sweep, as if recreating the path of someone walking, the same path I had watched her take. I radioed for EMS out of instinct, but the moment I pressed the button, only static hissed back at me. No signal, no confirmation. Nothing but a soft, breathy crackle that almost sounded like someone exhaling directly into the speaker. The driver's breathing grew panicked, his fingers clutching at my sleeve with surprising strength. She came out of nowhere, he choked out. There was no time to stop. I looked down at the skid marks behind his car, then back toward the fog, feeling that same impossible stillness settle over the road. The sedan's mangled front end suggested a high-speed collision, but the pavement held no sign of impact. No debris, no secondary damage, no evidence of what he had hit. Only the crushed vehicle, and a man who swore he'd seen a woman where I had watched one vanish. The fog drifted again, almost in the shape of shoulders, of hair, of a slow and steady crossing. I felt the cold settle deeper, as if the air itself were waiting for me to notice something I shouldn't, and somewhere inside that shifting white curtain, I heard a faint breath, too close, too controlled, too human to ignore. Later, after the paramedics took the injured driver and the fog finally thinned enough for me to see more than a few feet ahead, I sat inside my cruiser with the engine humming low, trying to steady the tremor working its way through my hands. The morning light had a washed-out, lifeless quality to it, as if the sun couldn't quite push through whatever hung over mile marker 19. I queued up the dashcam footage because I needed answers, something concrete, something with measurable edges. The screen flickered, then stabilized, revealing the quiet stretch of road from earlier. Empty asphalt, low fog, my own figure moving in and out of frame like a ghost drifting too close to the lens. The timestamp marched along in its usual digital green until the moment I stepped away from the cruiser, walking toward the skid marks. Then the image wavered, almost like heat distortion, even though the temperature had been cold enough to stiffen my breath. I watched myself crouch near the pavement, watched the fog coil around me, and then, just before the wrecked sedan appeared, the camera caught something else. A silhouette, pale, unmistakable, drifting across the road with that same weightless gait I'd witnessed with my own eyes. It moved, as if gliding instead of stepping, its shape flickering in and out of the fog, bending the haze around its outline like a cloak. My breath caught in my throat as I leaned closer, replaying the few seconds again and again. The figure never looked toward the cruiser, never acknowledged the world around it. It simply crossed the lane and vanished into the whiteness beyond the shoulder. I hit pause, stepping through the footage frame by frame until I reached the moment when the figure was closest to the camera. In the grainy still, I saw something that sent a cold pulse through my chest. A second shape, smaller, narrower, walking several paces behind the first, almost tucked into its shadow. At first, I assumed it was another trick of the fog, an artifact from compression maybe, but the proportions were unmistakable. A child's height, a child's frame, drifting in the wake of the taller figure. The camera caught them only in fragments. The faint curve of a shoulder, the pale blur of a head tilted slightly downward, the hint of arms hanging limply at the sides. And then, in the very next frame, both figures vanished completely, as though someone had sliced them out of the image with a razor. I rewound to check the timestamp again, expecting it to read whatever time it had been when the sedan crashed. Instead, the numbers glowed back at me with the same cold precision they always had on this road. 3:12 a.m. But that wasn't right. The crash had happened minutes later. I tried jumping ahead, scrubbing through the remaining minutes of footage, but the timestamp didn't change. It stayed frozen, locked at 3:12, even while the rest of the video continued. Me running toward the sedan, radioing for EMS, inspecting the driver. All of it played out while the timestamp sat motionless, as if the camera had stopped acknowledging time altogether. A shiver rippled through me when I realized the recording was behaving like the fog, ignoring the rules, bending the minutes, refusing to follow the sequence of events. I leaned back in my seat, eyes still glued to the frozen numbers, feeling a pressure build low in my chest. The dashcam wasn't lying. It had caught everything exactly as it happened. It was time that refused to cooperate. And outside the cruiser, as the last remnants of fog drifted across the lane, I could have sworn they moved in pairs, one taller shape, one smaller, passing silently through the world they no longer belonged to. I returned to mile marker, 19 days later, the sky low and gray, the shoulders still slick from last night's rain, trying to see the road as daylight might strip it bare of the terror it held at 3:12 a.m. The highway was quiet in a way that felt deliberate, the kind of silence that waits and watches, patient, knowing you're out of place. The skid marks from before had faded, but the mud along the shoulder was soft, wet, and unyielding, perfect for leaving impressions. At first, I noticed one or two faint prints, small, barefoot, oddly precise, but as I walked closer they multiplied. Dozens of them now marched from the tree line toward the asphalt, all the same size, all pointed in the same direction, like soldiers on a single, silent mission. Each footprint pressed cleanly into the mud, no errant marks, no stumbling, no signs of hesitation, and none of them returned into the woods. They didn't curve or vanish. They simply arrived at the edge of the road and stopped, as if the earth itself had dictated their destination. I leaned closer to inspect one, brushing my gloved fingers along the damp earth. They were delicate but complete, each toe splayed just slightly, the heel pressed firm, and yet there was a weightlessness in the impression, like something moved without the burden of gravity, without the resistance of human form. I counted them out of habit, though the number changed depending on how long I looked. They seemed to multiply in the periphery of vision, expanding in a quiet rhythm I couldn't trace. A cold breeze lifted from the tree line, carrying with it the faint smell of wet pine and something else, something metallic and sharp, like iron dust. I held my breath, realizing that no wind had come through the path of the footprints. No branches bent, no leaves stirred, and yet the prints existed, fresh as if made yesterday. I followed the trail to where the asphalt met the mud, to the edge of the lane where the skid marks had ended days ago, and the footprints stopped abruptly, as if someone had taken a final step into a world I couldn't see. My boots made heavy impressions alongside them, but the small prints never faltered, never acknowledged my presence, never turned back. I crouched, tracing the nearest line with my fingers, feeling the chill of damp earth seep through my gloves. A shiver ran through me, not from the cold, but from the sense that the prints were intentional, like a guide pointing toward something I wasn't meant to understand. I stood, glancing up and down the road, searching for any movement, any sign that someone could have made them. But the highway lay empty. No cars, no birds, not a flicker of life beyond the mist still clinging to the trees. And yet the prints were alive in their own way, speaking in a language older than roads, older than asphalt, older than me. I imagined them stepping forward at 3:12 a.m., crossing the lane in single file, silent and determined, guiding something unseen from the woods to the center of the road. My watch ticked on my wrist, ordinary hands, ordinary seconds. But I knew it didn't matter. These footprints weren't bound to time, weren't bound to logic. They led somewhere, always toward the lane, never away. And as I finally turned to leave, the fog lifting slightly under the gray morning sky, I caught the faintest echo in the air. Soft, deliberate. A shuffle in the mud that didn't belong to me. I froze. My stomach knotted. The footprints hadn't moved, hadn't changed, and yet I knew they were waiting, still marching in the quiet, still following a path that refused to end. Night fell over mile marker 19, and the fog returned, heavier this time, swallowing the tire ruts and the footprints in a slow, suffocating wave. The road stretched ahead like a blank canvas, smooth and featureless, while shapes began forming inside the mist, faces pressed against the gray, shoulders leaning forward, the faint outlines of small children walking deliberately toward the asphalt. I felt the hairs on my arms stiffen, every instinct screaming that this was no ordinary fog, no ordinary night. But I couldn't move, couldn't tear my eyes away from the shapes that assembled silently, patiently, as if waiting for me to notice. My watch froze at 3:12 a.m. again, hands locked in place, the ticking of time erased in the presence of something that obeyed a different rhythm. The whispering of static floated across the empty highway, barely audible but insistent, wrapping around the trees, curling into the asphalt, threading through the silence, pressing against my ears like a living thing. The shapes advanced, steady and unhurried, gliding over the shoulder, across the lane, toward the center where the skid marks once ended and the footprints began, tracing the paths I had studied and feared in daylight. I realized then that this road did not simply take the dead. It guided them, lined them up, moved them along some invisible route that never led back into the woods. The children, or something that resembled them, did not step in mud, did not leave evidence of weight, yet the direction, the purpose was clear. I stepped back, boots scraping asphalt, but the fog swallowed each sound I made and the figures kept coming, their forms shifting in the mist, sometimes merging, sometimes separating, never fully solid, never fully gone. A low, rolling hum began, almost beneath hearing, vibrating through the metal of my cruiser, the pavement, even my bones. I wanted to call out to demand that they stop, that the road release them, but my voice refused to form, as though some law of this place had stripped it away. Shapes gathered, filling the lane, circling the spot where the tire tracks had stopped, where the barefoot figure had appeared, where the dashcam had frozen at 3:12. I realized then the truth of the pattern I had followed all these years. The road wasn't just cursed, it was conscious, deliberate. A slow, merciless guide that directed every life, every echo, every shadow toward its center, never allowing escape, never allowing clarity. My chest tightened, my breath shallow as the fog pressed closer, dissolving the boundary between road and tree line, figures and air past and present. And then, at the edge of my vision, I thought I saw movement beyond the children, a taller silhouette stepping from one line of fog into another, pausing to watch me, watching my comprehension shatter into pieces I could not gather. The mist thickened again, swallowing it, swallowing the road, and I knew I would never see the lane the same way again. Mile marker 19 had collected its victims, yes, but it also claimed witnesses, memories, and understanding, leaving only fragments behind suspended in time at 3:12 a.m., waiting for the next traveler foolish enough, or destined, to follow its silent, guiding hand. The woman in the reflective tape. The highway had been empty for so long that the officer could hear the low hum of her own engine vibrating through the steering wheel. a steady rhythm beneath the faint static of the radio as it searched for voices that weren't there. Just the occasional clipped dispatch update dissolving back into silence. The trucking corridor stretched ahead in a featureless band of asphalt swallowed by night, broken only by the distant glow of a lone semi drifting in and out of her high beams like a tired animal struggling to stay upright. She watched it weave once, twice, drifting hard onto the shoulder before sliding back too late, the trailer snapping behind it like something trying to correct for the driver's delay. At first, she thought fatigue or alcohol, the kind of thing that happened on long night hauls when the darkness worked its way into a person's bones. But, as she closed the distance, she noticed the driver's side mirror flashing pale in her lights, catching the reflection of a face turned not toward the road but toward the rear of the truck, glancing again and again as if something paced him back there. The officer eased off the accelerator, letting her cruiser move in behind the semi at a cautious crawl, studying the pattern of its motion. There was nothing unusual about the night. No wind hard enough to push tens of thousands of pounds of steel, no debris on the road, no signs of wildlife except the occasional glint of distant deer eyes far off in the tree line. Yet the semi jerked left once more, the trailer following like it was attached by fraying rope rather than a reinforced hitch. The officer flexed her fingers against the wheel, rolled her shoulder to settle the tension creeping upward, and reached for the switch without taking her eyes off the truck. The radio murmured something unintelligible. Just static and a brief flutter of sound that might have been a voice, or might have been her imagination playing tricks after too many quiet hours. But before she could ask dispatch to repeat, the semi jerked again, harder, as if the driver had seen something in his mirror and panicked. She activated her lights. In most stops, the driver hesitated or slowed gradually, but this one reacted instantly, almost too fast, veering to the shoulder before she even gave the full signal. Gravel kicked out from beneath the tires as the trailer swayed, the truck lurching like its weight shifted unevenly. She braked hard, stopping several car lengths back, giving herself space in case the driver lost control entirely. The cruiser's engine rumbled beneath her, steady but somehow foreign in the oppressive silence that followed. Through the distortion of the flashing lights, she watched the semi settle into stillness, though the trailer continued to shiver with a faint tremor that didn't match the engine idle. She narrowed her eyes. For a moment, just a single breath, she thought she saw movement along the side of the trailer, the reflective safety tape catching her lights and bending the glow into something too fluid, as if someone were running a hand along it from the far side. But when she blinked, the surface looked normal again, flat and clean, the kind of tape that glowed hard white in headlights and nothing else. The officer straightened, her senses tightening. Something wasn't right. The driver's silhouette slumped forward in the cab, not drunkenly, not lazily, but in a rigid tremble she could see even through the windshield. His head kept turning left toward the mirror, like he expected something to pull itself up beside him at any moment. She stepped out of her cruiser and the cold night air pressed against her skin, drier than usual, heavy in a way that hinted at a storm not yet visible. The open corridor stretched endlessly on both sides. No towns for miles, no pullouts except the thin strip of shoulder where the semi now rested, like a wounded animal. Her boots crushed gravel beneath her as she walked forward, and each step felt louder than it should have in such a quiet place. The radio crackled again behind her in the cruiser, but she didn't turn. Her focus stayed locked on the truck, on the way its mirrors trembled, on the way the reflective tape along its side caught the spinning blue-red of her lights and stretched the colors thin. She paused at the front corner of the trailer, letting her eyes adjust. The driver hadn't moved, but something about the air near the trailer felt charged, like standing close to a power line. Her breath fogged in front of her, even though the temperature hadn't dropped. And from somewhere behind the massive structure, hidden from sight, she heard the faintest sound, like footsteps struggling to keep pace with a vehicle that had finally stopped. She approached the cab with the steady pace she'd practiced for years, but even before she reached the driver's door, she could feel the fear inside that truck pouring into the night like heat from an open furnace. The man sat rigid behind the wheel, both hands locked so tightly around it that his knuckles shone white under the dashboard light, his chest rising in shallow, uneven pulls of breath. He didn't look at her at first. He kept his eyes fixed on the side mirror, the glass vibrating slightly from the engine idle, as though something beyond the darkness pressed at it. When he finally shifted his gaze toward her, the expression that met her was the wrong kind of panic, too focused, too certain, the kind that didn't come from fatigue or alcohol, but from witnessing something his mind couldn't reconcile. He forced the window down only halfway, barely enough for air, and in a voice strained thin by terror, he explained that he hadn't been weaving because he was drunk or tired. He had been drifting because he was trying not to look at what he swore had been running beside him. A woman, he said. No clothes, no details he could describe, just pale skin and long movement keeping pace with the truck, matching every correction he made even as he pushed the engine harder to escape her. He said she stayed just outside the reflective tape, never stepping fully into the glow, but close enough that every time he glanced into the mirror he caught glimpses of her reaching for the side of the trailer. The officer lifted her eyes to the road around them, scanning the vast stretch of empty asphalt and silent forest lining both sides of the corridor. There was nothing. No footprints in the gravel, no broken brush near the shoulder, not even the sway of branches that might hint at someone darting away moments before her arrival. The only sound was the engine's steady churn and the faint rattle of metal cooling on the trailer behind them. She asked him to look back at the trailer with her, to confirm whether the figure he'd seen might have been a trick of the light or exhaustion, but he shook his head so hard the seatbelt dug into his collarbone. His eyes slid back toward the mirror as if pulled by a force outside his control, and he whispered, not to her but to himself, that he wouldn't look again. Not even once. His entire body leaned away from that mirror, as though something waiting inside its reflection might spill out if he gave it his attention. The officer felt a prickle move along her arms, not from the cold, but from the clarity in his fear. People lied, panicked, exaggerated. She could recognize that kind of trembling. This wasn't that. Whatever he thought he'd seen, it had followed him long enough to carve itself into his nerves. She stepped back from the cab, letting the truck's door frame his shape in the pulsing lights of her cruiser. Behind her, the corridor stretched on in both directions, a narrow artery of silence. The reflective tape on the trailer glowed steady and still, but she noticed how the man refused to turn toward it, how he pressed his palms flat against the wheel like he was anchoring himself to reality. She'd handled enough strange roadside calls to know when a person was hiding something and when a person was hunted by it. And as the driver kept his gaze locked on the faraway tree line, refusing even the smallest glance toward the trailer's length, she understood that this stop was no routine check. Something had frightened him off the road long before she arrived. Something that might still be out there, standing just beyond the reach of their headlights. She left the cab behind and walked the length of the trailer, each step crunching softly across gravel that felt colder than the surrounding air, as if the ground along that side had been drained of warmth. The semi loomed beside her like the hull of a stranded ship, metal panels rising into darkness while her flashlight skimmed across bolts and rivets that shimmered in the pulsing red-blue of her cruiser. She expected to find loose straps or wind-slapped debris causing the earlier motion, some mundane explanation she could report later. Something that would make the trembling voice of the driver seem exaggerated rather than prophetic. But as she reached the midpoint of the trailer, the reflective safety tape caught her beam and responded in a way she had never seen. Instead of bouncing light cleanly back, the strip shivered, an unnatural quiver that didn't match the steady idle of the truck or the still air around her. The tape rippled as though fingertips on the far side were brushing along its surface, pressing inward from metal that should have been solid. She froze, angling her light to test the surface, but the quiver persisted, bending the reflection into a subtle wave that breathed in and out like slow exhalation. She lifted her flashlight higher, narrowing her focus, and the beam stretched along the tape as though something unseen reached out and pulled it sideways. The white reflection elongated far beyond the physical width of the tape, smearing itself into a pale streak that drifted across the trailer wall. For a moment she thought her eyes were playing tricks, but the smear pulsed, contracting and lengthening with a deliberate rhythm, like a body shifting just out of sight. She stepped closer, her heartbeat pushing a dull throb into her throat, and placed one hand lightly on the cold metal panel. It felt solid, dead even, but the tape trembled against her touch as though something on the other side of that steel barrier pressed its weight forward. She pulled back quickly. A soft metallic knock sounded from within, faint, deliberate, too centered to be a loose tie-down or cargo shifting inside. It tapped again, steady as a finger rapping from the opposite side. She glanced toward the cab, expecting the driver to have reacted, but he remained slumped forward, unmoving, staring rigidly into the darkness beyond his mirror. The officer swallowed and forced herself to continue around the trailer, telling herself that the knock could have been anything: cooling metal, a trapped rodent, the settling of freight after a long drive. But the rhythm had been too precise, too human, and the way the safety tape rippled, alive in the quiet, bending her light into unnatural shapes, followed her even as she stepped toward the far side of the semi, where the darkness thickened and the forest on the opposite shoulder pressed its silence closer to the pavement. The air changed again, sharpening into a metallic taste that clung to the back of her tongue. And she felt a sensation she rarely encountered on duty, the distinct awareness that someone, or something, was standing just out of sight, waiting for her to cross the corner of the trailer. Her flashlight wavered in her grip, not from cold, but from a slow, spreading certainty that the driver hadn't imagined a thing. Something had run beside this truck, and whatever it was had not gone far. She moved down the far side of the trailer with the same steady caution she'd used on dozens of roadside stops, but something about the silence felt manufactured, as though the night itself were holding its breath and waiting for her to step too far. The beam of her flashlight skimmed over the metal panels, tracing dust, chipped paint, and a few streaks of mud from the long haul. Everything looked normal until her light crossed the reflective tape. Then she froze. The strip didn't show her outline the way it should have. Instead, it showed the distinct silhouette of a woman standing behind her, perfectly still, perfectly shaped, perfectly wrong. For a moment she didn't turn, didn't breathe, didn't trust her own instinct to confirm what she felt crawling up her spine. She waited for the warm push of a presence or the sound of feet shifting on gravel, but the world behind her stayed hollow and airless, as if cleared of anything living. Only when she forced herself to glance over her shoulder did she see the truth. Nothing. No one. Just an empty stretch of shoulder, the guardrail gleaming faintly, and the black mouth of forest beyond. Yet, in the tape, the silhouette remained, tilted slightly, as though its head rested against her shoulder, as though it were listening to her pulse hammer its way up her neck. She swallowed hard and stepped sideways, slow and deliberate, expecting the reflection to mimic her movement or disappear. But it didn't. The pavement under her boots shifted, but the dark, feminine outline in the tape stayed planted in place, rooted like a shadow cast by a body that wasn't there. She felt an impossible pressure bloom in her chest. Not pain exactly, but the tightness of being watched from a space she couldn't turn toward. A faint hum rose from the trailer panel, a subtle vibration she felt through the air more than through her fingertips. She eased her hand against the metal anyway, and the cold shocked her, the kind of cold that felt inhabited. The silhouette in the tape responded immediately, its head tilting a fraction further, a curious lean toward her as if it sensed her touch and welcomed it. She backed away without thinking, boots crunching on the grit of the shoulder, but the reflection did not retreat. It stayed upright, aligned with the trailer but angled toward her, like a portrait refusing to break eye contact. She remembered the driver's trembling insistence about the woman who kept up with him, running alongside the trailer as though the distance between human and inhuman meant nothing. She had dismissed it as fear, exhaustion, headlights playing tricks, but now she wasn't sure this was anything as comforting as a hallucination. Something about the reflection felt hungry, as though being seen gave it weight, as though the tape itself had become a window and it stood on the other side, testing the glass. The air thickened. Her breath came out colder than before, fogging faintly in front of her, even though the night wasn't cold enough for that. When she raised her flashlight again, the silhouette leaned closer in the reflection, its shape stretching by an inch or two, just enough to register that it had acknowledged her movement. She felt a pulse of dread hit her stomach, sudden and deep, and she took another step back, wanting distance, wanting the cruiser behind her, wanting anything except that silent black outline pinned to the tape like a memory, trying to force its way into the present. But as she moved, the reflection didn't fade. It only grew sharper, clearer, as though it had finally decided she was worth its attention, and wasn't ready to let her walk away. She stepped closer to the trailer, her boots crunching the gravel, trying to steady the tremor running up her legs, but the reflection in the safety tape had already begun to change, stretching unnaturally as if the light itself had been pulled through some invisible hand. The pale silhouette elongated, its arm reaching out across the smooth white strip, dragging the light into a smear that crawled like smoke along the metal panels, impossible and deliberate. Every instinct she had told her to back away, to retreat to the cab where the driver sat frozen. But a morbid curiosity rooted her in place, eyes locked on the impossible figure that had no business existing there. Her radio crackled suddenly, a sound that wasn't dispatch, static and whispering, repeating the driver's earlier words in fragments. She kept up with me, looped over and over, rising in a rhythm that matched the pulsing smear on the tape. The trailer felt alive, vibrating faintly beneath her touch, the metal humming in tune with the distorted voice from the radio. She took another step, and a low metallic groan echoed from the trailer's frame, sending a shiver through her spine, and the hairs along her neck stood rigid. Then the driver screamed, a sudden, raw sound that ripped through the night, and she spun toward the cab, heart hammering, and saw him thrown against the horn, hands gripping it like a lifeline, pupils dilated and eyes fixed on something she couldn't see. The blaring horn tore at her nerves as the radio continued its fractured chant, the distorted voice repeating the same phrases in overlapping loops. She wanted to run, but her feet felt cemented to the gravel. Her flashlight wavered in her grip as she shone it across the tape, and the silhouette shifted again, its arm reaching farther, the smear widening, now brushing as if across her shoulder, though she had moved back several feet. It was no longer a reflection. It was a presence, insinuating itself into the world she thought was real. The wind picked up around her, carrying the faint scent of ozone and metallic tang, curling into her nose, into her lungs, and her breathing became shallow, ragged, every inhale sharp as knives. She stepped toward the cab to pull the driver out, but he lurched violently, slamming his body against the horn again, frozen in terror, screaming incomprehensible words. The tape glowed brighter under her light, the smear extending further, dragging shadows across the trailer as if fingers were pressing through the metal itself. The hum from the radio intensified, now layered with the sound of dragging footsteps circling the cab, though the lot was empty, and her K9, still caged in the cruiser, growled low, barking at nothing visible. She felt the air thicken, heavy and hot, as if the trailer had exhaled around her, and the shadow in the tape mirrored her every movement in impossible ways, leaning closer, curling its arm into angles her body could not bend. She tried to pull her gaze away, tried to convince herself it was a trick of the light, the reflection, exhaustion. But the screech of metal under the truck's weight, the driver's wide eyes, the distortion of the tape, all insisted on reality. She felt a pressure on her shoulder, faint but insistent, as though the white smear had finally reached for her, and every whistle tensed in panic. The scream of the driver, the wail of the horn, the looping voice from the radio, the impossible stretch of light across the tape, they all converged into a single, overwhelming certainty. Something had followed them. And it was no longer content to remain just a reflection. As she stood frozen, the tape rippled one last time, fingers of white light reaching outward, and she realized that, whatever it was, it could cross into the space she occupied, and she might have no choice but to feel it touch her. She stumbled back toward her cruiser, heart hammering in her chest, every nerve screaming to get away, but the air felt thick, heavy, as though the night itself had congealed around the trailer and refused to let her move freely. Her fingers fumbled for the radio, twisting the knob, praying for a voice that could anchor her to reality. But all that came was static and a low, distorted whisper that repeated fragments of the driver's earlier warning. She kept up with him, over and over, looping in a cadence that matched her racing heartbeat. She tried again, twisting and tapping, and the whisper persisted, as if the device itself had become a conduit for something watching, something patient. Her flashlight beam swept across the cab and the side of her cruiser, and that's when she saw it. Perched on the steps of her own unit, just inches from the door, the same pale silhouette, unmoving yet impossibly aware of her. Her breath hitched, fogging in the cold night air, and the hairs on her arms bristled, each one pointing toward the impossible figure that crouched where nothing should exist. She blinked, and for a heartbeat it seemed as though the shape had solidified into a shadow of herself, leaning closer, testing her presence. But the space beside her remained empty to the touch, chilling her shoulder as though the cold of the metal steps had pressed against her skin. Her pulse pounded in her ears as the silhouette's outline shifted slightly in the reflection, tilting its head, watching her, and she felt an instant visceral dread, a recognition that this was not a trick of light or fatigue. It was deliberate, aware, and patient. She inched back toward the cruiser, every step cautious, boots crunching in the gravel, but the figure remained in perfect alignment with the steps, defying logic, defying distance. The smell hit her next, faint and metallic, with a sharp tang of ozone, like electricity and burnt wiring, curling into her nostrils and settling deep in her chest, and she gagged slightly, trying to ignore it, trying to force rational thought into a situation that refused reason. Her hands shook as she gripped the door handle, but the silhouette did not disappear. It lingered, watching, waiting, perched like a predator above a threshold she had always considered safe. She forced herself to glance around, behind the cruiser, toward the trailer, the asphalt, the empty forest. But nothing moved. No sound betrayed a presence except the distorted radio and her own shallow breathing. And yet, when she turned her gaze back to the steps, the reflection remained, closer now, almost pressing forward, though the space beside her was empty, air cold and still. Her mind raced through every scenario, every explanation, but the deeper she looked, the less sense it made. The reflection existed where nothing should, moved where it could not, and waited for her acknowledgement. She wanted to call out, to demand it leave, but no sound came from her throat. only a trembling exhale that disappeared into the night. The K9 barked suddenly from inside the cruiser, frantic and sharp, and she jumped at the sound, realizing the animal sensed what her eyes could barely comprehend. Panic surged. She yanked open the door, planning to climb inside and escape, but as she did, the figure flickered in the reflection, vanishing so abruptly that the steps looked empty, normal, harmless, except for the lingering metallic scent, the electric weight in the air, and the unshakable feeling that it had not truly left, that it waited somewhere in the night for her to step back out. She froze, hand on the door, heartbeat hammering, eyes scanning the shadows, aware that the world she trusted had warped into a place she could no longer measure, and that the silhouette might already be moving again, patient, inevitable, and entirely unseen. Dot backup arrived later than she expected. Lights cutting across the highway in harsh blue and red streaks that painted the trailer and her cruiser in jagged flashes. She stood between the two vehicles, steady in posture but hollow in expression, her gaze flicking between the truck and her own unit as though uncertain which was real and which belonged to the night's illusions. The driver was slumped in the cab, alive but trembling. Hands slack against the wheel, eyes wide and unseeing, repeating fragments of words she couldn't understand, as if the memory of what had happened was locked behind some invisible barrier. She tried to explain, to recount the events, the shifting silhouette, the stretch of the white reflective tape, the metallic knocks that had come from nowhere, but the words felt inadequate, thin against the weight of the night. Her cruiser's dash cam had captured everything, but the files were corrupted. Light streaks and shadows warped across the screen, forming abstract shapes she could barely interpret, and every attempt to stabilize the footage only collapsed it further. Yet one frame remained intact, an image frozen in time. A smear of white tape pressed firmly against her shoulder in the shape of a hand, impossible in its clarity, impossible in its reality. She stared at it, heart thudding, knowing that no one else would see it, would believe it, yet it pressed on her mind with the weight of certainty. Around her the night was calm again, deceptively so, but the memory of the driver's screaming, the horn blaring uncontrollably, and the shifting, reaching figure lingered like a presence at the edge of perception. She ran her fingers along the dash, along the steering wheel, anything to remind herself that she had not imagined it, that the white smear had left something behind. The backup officers moved cautiously, scanning the lot, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, but they saw nothing. No footprints along the shoulder, no figure crouched on the steps of her cruiser, no reflection in the tape. She realized that she had become the witness to a reality that existed just outside comprehension, a place where the ordinary laws of reflection and matter had been suspended, and where a single hand-shaped smear could linger in memory and on tape long after the presence had gone. The driver could recall nothing but the sensation of being watched, of the tape reaching, the figure keeping pace with him even as he had fled, and she felt the same creeping unease settle into her bones, a cold reminder that something had followed them both, had imprinted itself, and perhaps remained. Every detail, the subtle ripple of the tape, the metallic knocks, the smell of ozone, had been recorded in her mind as clearly as it had in the dash cam, preserved in a way that no explanation could diminish. She looked back at the semi, still parked in the darkened corridor, and felt the hum of the night around her shift subtly, as if it remembered, as if it waited for her acknowledgement before it would allow peace. The frame on the footage glowed faintly in her vision whenever she closed her eyes. A white hand pressed into the impossible, tangible and impossible at once, a reminder that the events of this night were not bound by the laws she trusted. She knew that this would not end here, that the image, the sensation, and the memory were stitched into her now, a permanent mark left by something patient, deliberate, and entirely beyond understanding. And as she turned toward the backup officers, outwardly calm but inside unraveling, she felt a whisper of cold air at her shoulder, a reminder that the frame that shouldn't exist had not been content to remain trapped in digital memory alone.